guys, welcome back to Based. We're at episode 7, and let me just tell you, I am sliding into episode 7 with dirty skin knees because I have had a tech month. As you can see, I have a new microphone. For those of you who have followed me for a while and know about what a tech boomer I am, I'm sure you can imagine the stress this has caused me. I had just figured out my Yeti mic, felt like I had it down, and then I took a new job. As you might have seen on my social media, I'm now working full-time at the Foundation for Economic Education, which I'm so stoked about. But that meant that I had to turn in all of my previous company's property. And that included a lot of my tech gear. So I had to send my Yeti in. I had this beautiful microphone that Young Voices had given me when I started my program that was still in the box. So huge shout out to Josiah Cox, my youngest brother, who rigged this for me and got it all set up. It's been a lot, so bear with me. I think we're going to be fine, but I'm kind of a little stressed coming into this episode. Today, our subject is unions. Specifically, the episode is titled The Problem with American Unions. When I started this show a couple of months ago, I polled a lot of my social media audience and asked for topics that you wanted to hear me discuss or talk about. And I noticed over and over that I had several people that asked me to talk about unions. And I thought it was sort of random, I guess. I've just never had unions really high on my list of priorities. I think because I've lived predominantly in the Southeast most of my life, they've really never been a factor. They don't have a huge presence down here. And it's just something that, as a whole, membership is way down in unions. They've lost a lot of their political power. It felt like an issue that used to be a very big, prominent one in this country and that had sort of dissipated over time. But I guess I kind of had this naive mentality that unions would just sort of tuck their tail beneath their legs, count their losses, and go home. And that's silly because this group loves to use coercion and force to get their way. And recently, they seem to have found a new political puppet in President Joe Biden and his administration. And there have been a series of actions and policy proposals that have come up that actually have made me reconsider the pressing nature of this topic. And so I moved it up in my list of subjects I was going to cover. I was going to put it kind of far off down the road, but I instead decided that we would do it now. So we're going to be talking about unions, specifically unions in America, the United States. This is kind of a more complicated topic than some of the other ones that we have discussed here, because unions technically could be a free market entity. It could be something that I would support in theory. And to understand why they aren't in this country, we have to really sort of disentangle the concept of what unions are from the reality of how they function. So to do that, we're going to look at the history of unions. We're going to look at the role that government has played in their equation. We're going to look at the problems they've created. And we're going to look at the actions that they're now taking to sort of try to regain their stronghold. So if I end up dead and buried under a baseball stadium after this episode, we know why. I thought that would be funny, but actually kind of just creeped me out. So anyways, let's get started. First, the definition of unions. A union is defined as an association of workers formed to protect workers' rights and advance their interests. Sounds harmless enough, right? I'm often asked why unions are not a free market response for workers to address problems that they have with their employers. And if we were using this definition, and that were the beginning and end of their functionality, then it would be a free market response. It would be a good thing. I think it's great for individuals to form together in numbers and use their lobbying weight to affect the free market in a way that would benefit them. All of that's fantastic. If an employer were not paying people enough money, workers banding together and lobbying for more money collectively would have more sway than one person going and trying to get a raise. And that would be a free market solution to a problem, as opposed to using government force against others, which is ethically wrong and also, as we know, has all kinds of unintended consequences. A really good example of this actually would be the cast of the popular sitcom Friends. I grew up watching Friends. I don't know if you did, but it was a huge success in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it had a core of 6 cast members, and they felt that they were underpaid given the success of the show. So they agreed to all demand $1 million per episode or they wouldn't come back. They all had to get $1 million per episode. And And they got it, because one of those cast members would have been replaceable, but all six, NBC couldn't replace all six of its stars. And so they got their $1 million per episode, which actually was the highest TV actors had ever been paid in history. So that's a free market collective bargaining example. And I would wholeheartedly support that. Absolutely. Get your money. Love it. A union is simply when a group of workers pay a third party to do that kind of collective bargaining for them. And again, as long as the individuals choose to join that union, I have no problem with it whatsoever. Wholeheartedly support it. But a look at history proves that in practice, that element of choice, which is so key here, has often been removed when it comes to unions, and instead government force or other third-party force has often been involved in the equation. So let's look at the real world instead of merely looking at the definition of the word. I want to look first at the history of unions in America. Now, again, I'm focusing on the United States because unions don't look the same in every country, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in the episode, but we need to really hone in on this country and not go too far out to understand some of the problems. So first, trade unions in some capacity have virtually always existed in the U.S. A couple of the early milestones: the first recorded instance of a worker strike occurred in 1768 when journeyman tailors protested a wage reduction. And then you had this period from 1760 to 1840 where we had the Industrial Revolution. And during this time, you have workers beginning to concentrate in cities. Many are working in large factories. And this is sort of the perfect framework for unions to prosper in. They start concentrating around certain skills and trades and then forming larger unions for all the different trades within a factory. And so it kind of starts to become a bit more organized, if you will, during that time period. After the Civil War, which was in the 1860s, that ended slavery. You saw the need for labor increase and the prominence of labor unions grew. But they didn't look out for all workers. Their membership was mostly for white, native-born males, and they were used to shield this group from competition by other workers who maybe would have had lower costs to employ. Now, this is a really important point because throughout their history in the U.S., unions have existed to protect some workers at the expense of others. And this is obviously not achieved through free market means because capitalism gives everybody equal opportunity. Instead, unions seek to benefit their workers at the expense of others in many of the same ways that another group does, the government. So you see them mess with the law of supply and demand, fight for tariffs against free trade, work to restrict immigration. They work for regulations and other government infringements that protect one class at the expense of another. Now, if you listen to episode 6 of Base, the last episode, which was on capitalism, you know that unions can't do these things without the force of government, and you certainly cannot do them in a free market. And so this is where unions become problematic in this country from the very beginning, but we'll circle back to this as we progress. Organized labor really gets up and going. It really gets its muscle in 1886 with the formation of the American Federation of Labor, AFL. This is still around. It's now the AFL-CIO, but you'll still see it. And this is a sort of umbrella organization for trade unions. Now, there's some important things to note here. The AFL was founded and led by Samuel Gompers. Gompers was a very political man. He was heavily influenced by Marxist teachings, but he did not believe that unions should be overtly political. Instead, he saw them as a conduit for class warfare, essentially. He thought workers needed an us versus them mentality so they would rise up and overthrow the economy. And he thought political wins would actually keep workers striving for a utopia under the current system instead. So he very much did not want government involvement in his organized labor. And you'll see that this mentality is one that actually has pretty deep ties throughout the organized labor movement. Gompers had two guiding principles for the AFL, and he ruled with a pretty iron fist. He was a very powerful guy, still a very big name in the history of labor unions, had tremendous impact on the movement. And the first principle that he ruled by was voluntarism. Now, libertarians will recognize this term or this concept as we continue to hold to it. And what it basically means is that you have a system where actions are taken voluntarily by the individual. So simple, a baby could come up with it, and yet we have such a hard time with it. Gomper used voluntarism to mean that individual unions had the right to join or leave the AFL at will, and he also used it to express his position of rejecting a role for the state in industrial relations. In 1883, Gompers actually told a Senate committee that the U.S. Constitution does not give our national government the right to adopt a law which would be applicable to private employments. Gompers' second principle that he ruled the AFL with was based around trade union autonomy, and this reasserted the independence of the national unions within their craft jurisdictions and affirmed their right to order their own internal affairs. And this is kind of important because it was under this principle or reasoning that many of the unions were able to be segregationists and still participate within the AFL. And this continued for decades. You see a lot of discrimination in the history of the labor movement against people of color and against women. But I have to say that, reading up on Gompers was fascinating. He obviously was coming from a vastly different political ideology than I am, but he didn't see government regulation or force as the means by which he wanted to achieve his ends, and that kind of made me respect him. If you're a commie and you want to, build a commie world without forcing me to partake in it and using the government against me, I guess we could sit down at a table and have a conversation, We could start from there. Furthermore, a biography on Gompers actually notes that he, rejecting his earlier Marxism as unrealistic in an expanding democratic American society, Gompers went on to wage unrelenting war on socialists of every stripe who sought to influence AFL policy, and he sharply distanced the organization from the populist movement as well. So he had a change of heart. Pretty complicated guy. I read a pretty cool biography on him. It's in my notes, by the way. I haven't mentioned this live, but I am posting a link to my outline with all of my links and notes on my Substack every episode. So if you really want to dig into the meat of my material, it's on there. Just go into the archive and you can click the different episodes and get all the resources you want. So anyways, while Gompers held the marriage of unions and political activity at bay during his tenure, he faced a lot of opposition. And by the early 1900s, unions were very much engaged in political activity. The AFL and the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions worked to establish the Department of Labor in 1913, which we still live under to this day. And they were behind the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914, which is a massive piece of legislation still in effect. It has been expanded over time, but it includes many types of regulations for businesses like the ability to block mergers, restrictions on pricing, the ability to break up monopolies. But, and this is important, it exempted labor from these regulations. Dude, this is what they always do. It's regulations for you, exceptions for me, and it's one of the oldest tricks in the books, and Americans have got to quit falling for it. Somehow people manage to persist in this fairy tale mentality that regulations are about protecting people and not about rigging the system against some on behalf of others. Come on. Gompers dies in 1924, and then the political activities of unions really open up. William Green takes over the AFL, and he continues its movement away from this sort of pure and simple unionism of, we just want to get fair working conditions. And he moves it towards the more politically involved social reform unionism that is characteristic of organized labor throughout the mid-century. During the 1920s, unions lose some influence, but then the Great Depression quickly reverses this trend. You have workers that are turning to their local trade unions to find employment and protectionism, and boy, did they offer it. By now, we are at, you guessed it, FDR's White House. It's his reign, and things are about to hit the fan, as I'm sure you could have predicted if you watched this show. Things always really take a turn around this time period in our history. Now, Roosevelt was super pro-union, and he helped to pass several bills that spurred the growth of these organizations, which we'll touch on in just a second. But it is important to note that even FDR was opposed to public sector unions, which are still the most powerful in existence today. This is an issue that people are finally waking up to on the left and the right, and I'm stoked about it. I'm amped. We've seen teachers' unions hold kids and families and their tax dollars hostage this year, refusing to open up the schools or let school choice move forward so that families can take their tax dollars and go to schools that are open. We see, police unions protecting bad cops, preventing criminal justice reform. These people work against the public on the public's dime. And they should be eliminated. And all of these problems, are things that could have been predicted all along, and they were, even by FDR. public sector unions are a terrible idea. Is that idea so bad FDR was opposed to it? I've never heard of an idea that bad. Like, just blows my mind. FDR considered, it unthinkable and intolerable that government unions could strike, because when they strike against taxpayers. And he believed that furthermore, when government unions are collective bargaining, it means voters don't have the final say on public policy. Instead, their elected representatives must negotiate spending and policy decisions with unions. That's not democratic. And that's something that, leftist leaders apparently used to recognize. So I'd love to see some action on that these days. But back to the private sector, because that was fair game under FDR. And under his New Deal package, there were a lot of laws passed that gave private sector unions the force of government behind their negotiations and allowed their influence to skyrocket. William Green, again, of the AFL, he backed a lot of these reforms and pieces of legislation, and he was very crucial to getting passage on things like the 1932 Norris-LaGuardia Act, which severely limited the use of injunctions in labor disputes and abolished so-called yellow dog contracts that required workers to agree not to join a union as a condition of employment. That same year, Green gained Federation endorsement for a national unemployment insurance system funded primarily by employer contributions, and he later helped pass the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, which majorly overhauled labor law. This last law is a big one, and it also has FDR's fingerprints all over it. Libertarian scholar Tom Woods writes about this act. The act gave labor unions a degree of legal insulation afforded to no other group in society. The act made labor unions immune to the claims of vicarious responsibility. In plain English, that means that labor unions are not legally responsible for any violence their members might commit, even if union officials themselves order the violence. So, essentially, this period of legislative policy during the 1930s puts the muscle of government behind organized labor. It's no longer about groups, organically working and coming together to lobby for better conditions. It's about using the government's heavy hand against businesses, enriching labor, and giving them a hammer by which they could force both workers and employers under their thumb. So, to thank FDR for all these special favors, unions threw their political muscle behind his re-election campaign in 1936, and from that point on, unions and the Democratic Party are basically synonymous. They are completely in bed together. By the 1950s, unions in the U.S. had successfully organized approximately 1 out of every 3 non-farm workers, and this period represented the peak of labor's power. They continue sort of their golden years through the 1960s. In 1962, JFK expands union power again by issuing an executive order that gave public employees the ability to unionize. Thanks a lot, guy. Now we're stuck with them. And so from the late 1940s to mid-1970s, labor unions are on the up and up. They have a ton of political power, lots of money, millions of members. But their heyday was short-lived, and for good reason. Between 1975 and 1985, union membership fell by 5 million workers. In manufacturing, the unionized portion of the labor force dropped below 25%, while mining and construction, which were once labor's flagship industries, were decimated. Only in the public sector did the unions hold their own. By the end of the 1980s, less than 17% of American workers were organized, which was half the proportion of the early 1950s. And that decline has only continued. Today, private sector unionization is at its all-time low, with only 6.2% of workers opting in. And it's worth noting that public sector unionization continues to be much higher. It's about 5 times higher, but it still represents just over 7 million Americans. So it's a very tiny proportion of Americans who are in labor these days, or in unions. So what gives? Why did unions fall out of favor? In short, corruption, abuse, and a recognition, I think, that they just merely aren't worth their trouble. After the passage of the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, unions became emboldened. They began employing coercive practices against workers and employers, forcing people to pay for work employees did not even do, bullying workers into membership, racketeering, harassing non-union workers. The rap sheet goes on and on. This led to the Taft-Hartley Act Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, which placed some restrictions on unions and worked to suppress communist influence in the labor movement, which had grown quite prominent. It's worth noting that after 1933, the Communist Party made great strides by switching from activism in the unemployed sector to aggressive union building among those who did have jobs. There was a great upsurge in communist participation and influence in labor unions, especially in the Pacific Northwest. And this is a trend that had continued throughout even now, continued throughout the following decades. And I would say there's still a lot of that sentiment now. So communist theory really courses throughout organized labor as a whole. In the mid-1900s, unions also began using another powerful entity to bully workers and employees into their submission: the mafia. Now, this is where I really had a great time researching this episode, because I don't know if you know this about me, but I am fascinated by the mafia. Like, they're not cool, they're bad, they're, violent, and it's wrong. But I don't know, there's just something so interesting to me about the mafia. I love watching mafia movies and reading mafia books. I like going to Vegas and looking for the mafia. Like, I don't know, this was my favorite part of the episode, so I hope you like it. This issue begins to gain national attention in the 1950s. Robert F. Kennedy, who hated the mafia, was then serving as chief counsel for the Senate Rackets Committee, publicly started grilling Jimmy Hoffa and others. And Jimmy Hoffa was the former president of the Teamsters Union. And he was grilling them about, mob ties. And Hoffa just didn't really deny it. He was kind of a tough guy, blue collar, like rough and tumble. And he's like, these are things I have to do to protect my workers. And it, kind of backfired on Kennedy and the government, because the Teamsters Union was like, yeah, that's our guy. And they were stoked about Jimmy Hoffa. But Kennedy didn't let it go. And after he became Attorney General in 1964, he basically went on the hunt for Hoffa. He had a whole special committee that was trying to get Hoffa. And that accumulated in convictions against Hoffa in 1964 for jury tampering and defrauding the union's pension fund. Despite that setback, Hoffa's hold on the Teamsters presidency remained firm even after he entered federal prison in 1967. Loyalty. They were behind him. Hoffa, of course, went on to be murdered by the mob in 1975. Allegedly, but he was murdered by the mob, come on. And this made him a household name. His body has never been found. No one was ever arrested for the crime, but the incident forever intertwined the image of organized crime and organized labor in the minds of Americans. And it's not an invalid stereotype. The President's Commission on Organized Crime in 1986 concluded that the mafia had for decades controlled and corruptly influenced certain major labor unions in the United States, including the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the Laborers International Union of North America, the Hotel Employees and Restaurant Employees International Union, and the International Longshoremen's Association. While law enforcement really cracked down on racketeering and the mafia in the 1980s and 1990s, it hasn't put a stop to the corruption in labor, nor to its ties to the mob. The American labor movement is still plagued by rampant corruption, embezzlement, racketeering, and influence from numerous organized crime organizations. A couple examples. During fiscal years 2000 to 2019, labor investigations led to over $156.3 million of restitution and over 2,100 criminal cases. Those investigations also produced 2,297 indictments and 2,166 convictions. Lots of cases. The Department of Labor's Office of Labor Management Standards has investigated and prosecuted union leaders for embezzling more than $100 million in union dues since 2001. Investigations by the Department of Labor's Office of Inspector General, which investigates labor racketeering and organized crimes influence within the labor movement, that's resulted in more than $1 billion in fines, restitutions, and forfeitures. These guys are busy. Fewer than 5% of unions audited by the Department of Labor received unqualified passes. And there was a 2008 case I came upon, which it just, I don't know. I guess I'm just really sheltered, but it kind of blew my mind this kind of thing was still going on. And this case really exemplifies the continued harassment, battery, and intimidation experienced by many at the hands of unions. The former union president of the International Union of Operating Engineers Local 17, based out of Buffalo, New York. He was convicted on racketeering charges after repeated acts of vandalism against non-unionized construction sites in the area. The case stemmed from a 5-year joint federal, state, and local investigation into a series of reported assaults, threats, and property destruction at construction sites in western New York State that began in 1997. So this isn't something that was like going on back in the 50s. This is modern era. And as you can see from this history, unions have rarely, if ever, operated as free market collective bargaining entities in this country. There's a reason there's so much hatred for them and why so much has been done to limit their power. They're abusive, they're coercive and corrupt, and oftentimes they're pushing a political ideology that's antithetical to our country, to our foundations, to our fundamental belief systems and ways of life. They're almost always an enemy of capitalism and free choice in this country, and they work against our systems by using government to force people to pay them money that they then use to work against people. It's very, very screwed up. Thankfully, some actions have been taken that have curtailed their political power in recent years and have restored rights and choice to individual Americans, and here are some of those actions. Recall that FDR passed the National Labor Rights Act in 1935. That was the big bill that really sort of rewrote labor policy. And under this, employees could be forced to join a union and pay dues. That was thankfully overturned by the Taft-Hartley Act that I also mentioned in 1947. And this act, Taft-Hartley, is what created what we currently know as right-to-work laws. Basically, right-to-work laws allow states to prohibit compulsory membership in a union as a condition for employment in the public and private sectors of the country. Currently, 27 states have passed such provisions. Most of the Southeast, which is why, again, they've just not been a factor in my life because I've mostly lived down here, and when people aren't forced to join them, they mostly don't. In these states, unions can still exist, and employees always have a choice to join them. They just can't be forced to. You'll often hear people be very misleading around that and say, employees need, better choices to join. They always have a choice to join. Always. It's just most of them don't when they don't have a gun to their head. Not everyone likes right-to-work laws. Obviously, unions and Democrats don't like them because they undermine their power and their political campaign funds. But some free market advocates also have an issue with them, and I want to be intellectually fair here, so I want to touch on this briefly and give you the free market argument against these laws, which is that they use government force to violate freedom of contract. If a workplace wants to sign a exclusive contract with a union, and a provision of that is for new employees to join the union upon hire, then what authority does the government have to intervene? I think that's a sound argument. I don't disagree with it. And I hate to cry, they started it, but they did. This is inevitably what happens. When one side uses the force of government punitively, the other side will respond in kind. And you have heavy-handed action after heavy-handed action, and it just keeps revving up. And ultimately what we get is more and more government intervention into the market, which makes all of us poorer. And we get worse and worse political divisiveness because people get angrier and angrier at each side using the force of government against them. So the only way to really stop this is for a ceasefire and government force behind organized labor. But neither side really seems interested in that these days. And I want to give an example of what the world could look like, what the union world could look like. And that's actually found in Scandinavian countries. Where unions do operate as a free market entity as a whole. Over there, unions are strongly pro-free trade and open markets. And if you listen to episode 1 of Based, you'll know why. These countries learned their lesson on socialism the hard way. They turned back to capitalism, 20 years ago. And despite lies told you by American socialists about the policies in these countries, they're actually arguably more pro-free market than we are. They recognize that free trade and free markets are the policies that benefit all workers the most. And interestingly, the labor market in these countries, the participation rate remains really high with over 70% of their people in a union, while the participation in unions in the United States and a lot of the rest of the Western world has plummeted in recent decades. In Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, there is no government-mandated minimum wage. Instead, unions negotiate on behalf of workers via collective bargaining for the minimum wage sector by sector. So they actually do their freaking jobs instead of using government to bully people. What a concept. And so there are models the U.S. could look to where I think unions could operate more fairly for people on both sides of the aisle. But unions here instead continue to use government to get their way. And so overall, I think right-to-work laws are a necessary step in peeling back their power and protecting workers against these people. But I do see the free market arguments against right to work, and ultimately would like to see, government entirely removed from the picture and out of, private employment negotiations altogether. That's where we should be trying to get to. Right to work laws have severely limited the power of unions in the private sector, but until a couple of years ago, they were still going strong in the public sector. This is a big turning point. The Supreme Court had ruled that while state employees could not be forced to join unions, they could be forced to pay the union agency fees. It was argued that since collective bargaining is done on behalf of all workers, regardless of their union membership status, it was unfair to let non-members get a free ride. And that had held for decades in this country. But that changed in 2018 with a man named Mark Janus. He was tired of having $45 a month taken from his check involuntarily and given to a union. Not only was he paying for a service he did not want and that he never joined, but the union, AFSCME, was also giving a lot of money to political causes that Janus stood morally opposed to. And so his case starts going. It makes it all the way to the Supreme Court, and they hear his case, and they ruled that it was a clear violation of the First Amendment right to free speech. You cannot force someone to fund something they do not agree with. As Thomas Jefferson said, to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. 100%. 100% it is. So this decision was a huge deal. It kneecapped unions like they used to kneecap people in the 50s. It basically severed their ability to force people to pay them. And again, turns out when they don't have the government force to force people into paying them, a lot of people opt out of participation. So this was also bad news for all their Democrat friends because, again, unions give a lot of money to Democrats. And so their piggy bank started to really dry up from right to work laws and from the Janus decision. And just to give you an idea of the scale, from Open Secrets, which is a political donation source online, total labor sector campaign contributions topped out during the 2016 election cycle, just 2 years before Janus, when groups and individuals poured more than $217 million into races nationwide. Almost 90% of those contributions went to Democrats, which is consistent with at least 2 decades of labor contribution trends. When I tell you these people hate Mark Janus, he got threats, all kinds of intimidation. He's endured a lot as a result of this case. He's a very brave man. I think he's a hero, quite courageous, and he did something really significant with his case. So where we're currently at is with an organized labor movement that has been backed into a corner. And they're kind of like a rabid, angry dog that is desperate to get out of that corner. They're working overtime, trying to regain their power and reverse some of these actions. And they have a lot of Democrat candidates who are desperate for their funds and trying to help them out with this. But they simply just don't have the support of the general public, which has largely spoken and doesn't want this in their lives. And here's a couple of the more recent actions. One, under the Obama administration, they tried to pass the Employee Free Choice Act. Never trust the name of these bills. Oh my gosh, they kill me. This was a sweeping Democrat push bill that thankfully failed. It sought to abolish the secret ballot among workers deciding on union representation because they want to be able to bully non-union workers. It sought to impose forced interest arbitration of contract disputes. It sought the selective protection of union health care benefits from proposed reform legislation, always seeking exemptions for themselves under the laws they push for others. They wanted to award assets seized from major automotive companies to United Automobile Workers, and they wanted the involvement of union personnel, especially members of the Service Employees International Union, in electioneering efforts and counter demonstrations on behalf of the Democratic Party. That, thankfully, did not pass. But that was a very sweeping piece of legislation that they attempted around 2007, 2008. Together with Democrats in the California General Assembly, unions pushed something recently called Assembly Bill 5, which actually went into effect last January. And this was an atrocious idea that applied a strict test to the definition of freelancers and made it practically illegal for people to accept or offer contract positions. Obviously, this had disastrous consequences. Our economy has changed and grown significantly in recent years. And as it's done so, the workplace and employment looks really different than it did at the height of union power. We're moving away from the 9-to-5 workday. Employees now have much more freedom. They stay at jobs for a shorter time period, something like 2.5 years on average. They have more flexibility in their schedule. And increasingly, they partake in the gig economy instead of full-time employment. Now, I'm not a full-time gig worker. I have full-time employment, but since I graduated college, at almost all times, I have participated in the gig economy. I almost always have side contracts, side jobs, other streams of income coming in. And I'm joined by 45 million other Americans. So this is something that has really taken off. Workers benefit from it. It allows them, to make more money, to have more autonomy, to build new careers and create more freedom. It's great for workers, but it's bad for unions who can no longer get their hands on these employees, even in states that have yet to pass right-to-work laws because they're operating outside of the organized workplaces where they have power. California's bill was an attempt to change that, and it sucked. And it immediately sucked. Lots of people lost their job last year in a very short time period, just as the pandemic was hitting, by the way. An example, Vox, the popular newspaper site, parted ways with 200 freelance journalists. There were musician co-ops that were having to shut down because they couldn't afford to pay all these people to work full-time and all of the, benefits and everything that goes along with employment. It's very expensive to hire full-time employees. And so there was a huge outcry across the state from workers who all of a sudden woke up to this impact. And in response, Uber and Lyft pushed a ballot campaign, which is very expensive to do in California. You have to have a lot of money. And they worked to exempt some workers from this very archaic new law. And this was Prop 22, and it passed overwhelmingly last fall. So it didn't totally get rid of Assembly Bill 5, but it carved out a lot of exemptions for people who use app-based services. So it was a huge win. Uber and Lyft were super heroic for taking that on. But after it passed, unions actually tried to sue to overturn the will of the people. They just show over and over and over that they aren't about choice. They aren't about democratic processes. They aren't about the little guy. They care about their power, beginning and end. I mean, they couldn't even get crazy commie California to go along with this scheme. It's so ridiculous. But did they give up? Nope. They are now actually trying to push the very same thing at the federal level in a package called the PRO Act. I'm hot under the collar about the PRO Act, guys. I'm going to be totally frank with you. I've written on it. I did a TikTok on it. I'm mad. The PRO Act does a few things, and Democrats have already passed it in the House. It restricts independent contracting like the California bill. It overturns right-to-work laws, and it forces employers to hand over private information on non-union employees, again, so they can harass them. This makes me so angry because, again, it would personally impact me, but I also think about, how much it would have impacted me 10 years ago. When I graduated college, I had a degree in music business. I was working in the entertainment industry, and I hated it. I wanted to die. I was miserable. And so I was looking at, how to get out of the music business, how to build into another career. I was thinking about potentially going back to law school or to psychology school, but I was sort of, up against the wall. I already had student loans. I didn't really want to take out more loans. It was going to be very hard for me to do that. And so I started working on the side in politics. And I kind of stumbled into that. I wanted to work alongside an attorney, see if I liked his day-to-day, see if it was worth my paying to go back to law school. And I met an attorney who was running a Second Amendment group in Tennessee. I thought, I love the Second Amendment, and I know how to organize events and do some of these things that he needs done for the organization. So I started working in a contract role for the Tennessee Firearms Association. And I fell in love with politics. I very quickly realized I wanted to work in this industry. But again, I didn't yet have the contacts or the skill set or the network to really move out of music and just jump into politics full time. That's not easy to do, to switch careers. And so I took a period of about 2.5 years, and I kept, working full-time in music, but doing a ton of contracts on the side. And through those opportunities, I met so many people. I got a lot of experience. I was able to hone in and figure out specifically what I wanted to do within politics, what I was good at. And then when I was ready, I made the full-time jump out of music into politics in 2016. If Democrats and unions got their way and passed this PRO Act, none of that would have been possible for me. It wouldn't have been available to me. I would have had to have gone back to school, taken on more debt, take time away from the workforce to go back to school and take on more debt. And I probably, knowing the way the education system works, still wouldn't have gotten a good job coming out at that point. It would have set me back tremendously. It would have likely trapped me in a career where I was desperately unhappy. It would have stagnated my growth. It would have hurt my income. It infuriates me. People use independent contracting in various ways, but it should only be up to the individual who they want to work for, what they want to work for, what kind of contracts or terms they want to negotiate. It is unfathomable to me that there are people in this country who think it's appropriate to tell individuals they can't make those decisions for themselves, and instead government and unions are going to do it for them. It is patronizing. It is horribly sexist. So many women are in the gig economy and doing independent contracting. It just honestly grinds my gears. I think it's offensive. And it just is something I think everybody should be mad about, whether or not it impacts them personally, because down the road it could. Independent contracting is an excellent way to make more money, pay off debt, save, have investments. It's just so stupid. I really can't handle it. The good news is that they won't be able to get it passed in the Senate, given the vote count right now. That is unless they get super radical and remove the filibuster, which we all know they've talked about. It would be about the dumbest action I've ever heard of, but I don't put it past them. So we'll have to see what happens, but that's the current threat facing us right now. And then on top of that, the unions have also recently turned their eyes to the tech sector, as it's one of the fastest growing in the country. They recently went all in on this tiny Alabama town with an Amazon plant in it, and they were working hard to push unions. They saw this as perhaps a big breakthrough for them in the South, within the company itself, which is a huge employer, and within the tech sector. But the problem is, workers are doing pretty swell without them. Amazon already pays $15 or more per hour. They have good benefits, and workers wisely, and again, overwhelmingly, voted them down on that prospect. Unions are now working to overturn that decision, trying to say that Amazon unfairly influenced the vote. Someone needs to tell these guys that no means no. All of these political activities are problematic, but unions have also created economic problems as well that show they simply are not worth the cost as they operate in this country. Unions at times may negotiate higher pay for their members, but they do that at the expense of workers at large. And this goes back to the basic law of demand. I told you we mention it here just about every episode. It's so essential. And you have to remember that this principle shows that as the price of a good or service increases, the quantity of that good demanded decreases. So when the cost to hire an employer goes up, companies are going to naturally hire fewer workers. So ultimately that means unions reduce the number of jobs in the country. Pushing companies to pay employees more than their productive value would otherwise demand also harms real wages in another way. Companies merely pass that increase in cost onto the consumer, making products more expensive and decreasing the buying power of all workers. People need to quit focusing so much on what they make and start asking why what they make can't buy more. There's a lot of things that traces back to in this country, and this is one example of that. People have got to get this basic concept through their head. Companies pass increased taxes and the cost of regulations onto you. By advocating for these things, you are advocating against yourself. Stop asking why you don't make more money. Start recognizing that when you advocate for these things, you're hurting your buying power. You're hurting the economy. And at the root of these problems are policies that intervene in the free market and make all these goods and services more expensive. You've got to start seeing how these things connect. Because until you do, you're going to keep advocating for things that actually hurt you in the long run. And that's the point of this show. I'm tired of people correctly seeing the problems in society and then prescribing the very things that created it in the first place, which is usually big government intervention. Back to unions. Unions also hinder the freedom of association. And this is an important bedrock principle. It means quite simply that you do not have to do business with people when you don't want to, and that you are also free to enter business arrangements when you choose. Again, Choice factor, big here. And I'm going to give examples that both Democrats and Republicans will like and ask that both sides find some intellectual consistency here and take a principled stance on this issue because we've really moved a long way away from it in this country. Republicans, freedom of association means the baker does not have to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding if it violates his religious freedoms and beliefs. I'm free to never shop at his bakery again because I think that's bigoted and stupid. That's freedom of association. That's a free market. That's capitalism. Democrats, freedom of association means that pharmaceutical companies who produce medicines can't be forced or co-opted into selling states those medicines for the purpose of killing people in execution chambers when it violates their ethical beliefs. And those who try to use subterfuge to violate that freedom of association, like Republican lawmakers across this country, should be held accountable. Consistency. Try it. Freedom of association is a very big deal. It's a fundamental natural right, and to violate it is a very serious matter. But unions do so frequently. They seek to eliminate the ability of non-union workers to secure employment in jobs that they would otherwise be eligible for, like in California and with the PRO Act. They seek to end certain kinds of working relationships and structures. They work to prevent the association of non-members and members. They block employees from negotiating on their own behalf, and they prevent workers from choosing alternative forms of group negotiation. Lastly, unions hurt investments, innovation, and growth in the economy at large. They reduce the profitability of companies. They make deadweight employees equal to hard workers, which disincentivizes productivity and hinders creativity. All of this means that workers have fewer options, a more stagnant economy, and a lower quality of life. And I think it is for these reasons that even when workers are given a choice, increasingly we see them turning away from that option in this country. Given all these factors and actions, I hope they continue to until we see massive change within organized labor. But as a whole, as it sits right now, it's a severely problematic movement that's done a lot of damage to our economy and to our workers. The right to work, to pursue the American dream, to be rewarded for your hard work and your ingenuity, these are natural, essential rights that unions seek to take from us. And I'm passionate about this. I love to work. Love it. Been working since I was like 10 years old. It's my favorite thing. I love to work. I love to see myself make gains. I love to make money. I don't want the government getting involved and preventing my ability to do this, and neither should you. Work is a good thing. It's a quintessential liberty for us to be able to, figure out what kind of work we want to pursue and to go out there and make it happen. We don't need government bullies in our lives or in our economy, and we certainly don't need their middlemen, which have been unions, either. If people want to band together and collectively bargain in the workplace, awesome. Fantastic. Just don't get the government involved in the process. That's the free market course of action, and it's the ethical one as well. All right. I hope you enjoyed episode 7 of Based. Don't forget, share, rate, review, subscribe. All of these things go a super long way. And otherwise, we'll see you back here the last Monday of every month.